Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over Game 5 from the 2013 World Chess Championships. The first 4 games have all ended in a draw. Good news for the fans is every game has gotten significantly better than the previous game. So if y'all remember from the first couple games, they pretty much just moved a couple pieces, immediately shook hands, and then took a day off. The last 2 games, although both were draws, actually went to the late game, and they actually tried at least to try to find some sort of win possibility, although it did end in a draw. So coming into Game 5, we have Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces, and Anand's going to be defending with the black pieces. And if you haven't seen the game itself, it is one of the most exciting games I've seen in a while, so definitely please to go ahead and go over it. So Magnus Carlsen decided to start with pawn to c4. A lot of people just were expecting, either that knight to f3, which we've seen. Maybe if he found some, better line in one of the games that he's already played. Obviously these players go back and look at their variations. If he didn't play this knight to f3, probably he just didn't find anything good with that, and so wanted to try something completely different, which he did, because c4 we don't see very often. But we see this pawn to e6 again. Black can really transpose into a lot of different defenses. Neither side is really, locked in as far as what they're going to do. Then we see this pawn here to d4, so kind of that queen's gambit. And then we see this pawn to d5, the queen's gambit decline line. And then after knight to c3, we see pawn to c6. Also pretty common. You could see knight here to f6, and then even pawn to e3, bishop e7. Knight to f3 right here, castle on the king side. You can see bishop to e2 here, getting ready to castle to here. This is what we see most common, but Anand actually decided to go into the semi-Slav line and play pawn to c6 here, recognizing that later on he's going to have to get his light square bishop outside of this pawn chain. A lot of times, if it stays right here, this knight will come here to d7. You'll have a knight here on d7. You also have a knight here on f6, and you'll kind of work from that. Really depends on how the game goes from here. Magnus Carlsen, even from here, played a rather interesting move. I think a lot of people were expecting either knight to f3 or pawn here to e3, which are both very common ways to attack the semi-Slav defense. Instead, Magnus Carlsen went for a pretty aggressive move, in my opinion, played pawn to e4. Again, it's definitely sound, but definitely something you don't see very often. We now see black take on e4, and then the knight's going to recapture, and now the bishop's going to swing down here. Now the knight's going to come back. It's a little awkward if bishop plays here to d2, because now the queen comes back here, takes on d4, and this is just a situation that Magnus Carlsen doesn't want to have to deal with. So instead he plays his knight to c3. Now Anand does have the option; he could just go ahead and take right here, give doubled pawns to Magnus Carlsen here on the c file. But again, high level play usually just don't see your opponents giving their person across the table from them doubled bishops if they don't have to. So the knight's going to come back here to c3, and then Anand plays pawn to c5, just allowing this pawn here to come to c5 if he wants to. Both sides will go ahead and trade off queens, and then this bishop will come here to c5, and this will be a completely fine game for black. Magnus Carlsen has other plans, so he pushes forward with a3, kind of forcing this bishop back, so we see the bishop come back here. And now we see some just regular development. Obviously you want to get all your pieces involved into the game. Knight to c3, knight to f3 are both pretty common moves, and so now we see knight to f6, and now we see bishop to e3. Could have also seen one of this other bishop move getting ready to castle. I think Magnus Carlsen kind of looked at this and he saw a lot of pressure building up on this pawn, on d4 here. Especially if this starts to push forward, this knight to c6 can get a little interesting. So playing this this bishop here to e3 also allows him, if he wanted to castle on the queen side, although that would be pretty tricky. Again, he's continuing his development from here. So the knight's now going to come to c6. Again, as we talked about before, typically in the semi-Slav, this knight's going to come here to d7, but if the pawns kind of move around, which we have, this pawn on c6 and d5 are no longer there, then this is a much more natural move for the knight here on c6 to, again, attack kind of that center of the board here on d4. So now we see the queen come to d3 for 2 reasons. One, really don't want to have this bishop take here on c3 and then these doubled pawns. So this queen here on d3 not only protects this knight here on c3, but it's still, holding down this pawn here on d4. Also protects this pawn here on c4. Another move, Magnus Carlsen could have also just played rook over here to c1. Both are going to be completely fine. The queen here on d3 also allows him if he wants to castle on the queen side, but he could always play this rook over here to c1, play this bishop here to e2, castle on the king side, and have a really good game. In the game, the queen comes to d3, and then after the pawn takes and the pawn recaptures, this knight's going to come here to g4. Pretty aggressive move from Anand, threatening to take this bishop here on e3. Black would now have the double bishop pair. Magnus Carlsen now plays an interesting move. He plays king castle on the queen side. Now, if you look at it again, the king isn't super safe. He does have a lot of pieces in front of him, but, again, there's not a lot of pawn structure in front of this, so definitely an interesting move, but also, again, very aggressive for Magnus Carlsen to say, you know what, this is going to be completely fine. I don't mind, having my king exposed a little bit because I'm going to be attacking for the rest of the game. So Anand goes and plays this knight here, takes on e3. Again, this is one of those where he wants to have that double bishop pair. And now the pawn's going to take on e3. And it's always important to realize how you should take. It would actually somewhat be a mistake if, the queen took here on e3. You can now see the bishop come back to b6, again putting pressure on this square right here. We can now see this knight come up here to b5, again, protecting this right here. And then, but then after, the castle on the king side, we could have this pawn push forward right here. Again, this knight can't really move too much because it's being pinned down. You could also see, this pawn here just coming to a6. That would also, take away one of these defenders right here on d4. So a lot of different ways than black can attack this. But instead, it's much easier. Since white's castled on the queen side, he's not too worried about moving this pawn here on f2. So decides to go ahead and just take with his pawn. And now he does have, this e pawn center of the board, which is always good. But he does have to be careful. Magnus Carlsen has kind of 3 pawn structures right now, so going in towards the endgame, he doesn't have the best pawn structure, but he has a much more active position in this game right now. So then we see the bishop come back here to c7, and Magnus Carlsen decides it's a good time to go ahead and start exchanging. So after we see the exchanges right here, now black also has 3 pawn structures. So, pawn over here, pawns over here. So, again, both sides equal in material. White definitely has a little bit more of an active position. He has, there's one completely open file, and he's controlling it with his D rook right here. So that's definitely good. He has a knight and a bishop, which can do extremely well together. Anand does have this double bishop pair, but they're not doing too much right now. Again, this light square bishop for black hasn't moved, which it rarely moves in the Semi-Slav defense, so something to keep in mind. This bishop's now going to come to e2, and we now see the king come to e7. Again, once the queens are off the board, you're not too worried about your king's safety. It doesn't have to castle, and so, as we approach the end game, you actually want to have your king involved in the game. So Anand just decides to play e7 because, he can swing this rook, but he wants to have his king actually centralized more so than in this corner here on g8. So now the bishop's going to come to f3, again starting to attack, get it more involved into the game. We now see black just defend with his bishop here on d7. And then we see the knight come over here to e4. Again, more centralized square, getting all of his pieces involved into the game. And now we see the bishop come over here to b6. Doesn't really do much because now just the pawn can push forward to c5 since it's being protected, add a little bit more pressure. But Anand decides to go ahead and just exchange pieces off. There's no great square for this knight to go to. It is the defender of the square, and so Magnus Carlsen just decides to go ahead and trade these off. Push forward, which is just going to be a little exchange, and so after we exchange right here, Magnus Carlsen swoops over and plays rook over here to f1. And so if we kind of look at it now, we've come down pieces, so both sides still have the same amount of material. White still has a much more active position. There's 2 open files on the board. Magnus Carlsen, as you can imagine, completely owns both of them with his rooks here on d1 and f1. So if we kind of look at how this is going to go, what's what's white trying to do? White's really looking to attack all the pawns on the light squares, really control, these long files. Also wants to make sure that black has, kind of a cramped position. Right now, black's not very active, so black wants to be active, and so that's going to be Anand's game plan. He wants to go ahead and get his rooks involved into the game. He wants this light square bishop to be doing more than it is, because right now it's just kind of hanging back here. So those are what both sides are kind of looking to do in this position. Anand plays rook here to b5, getting ready to come over here to e5, threatening both this bishop and this pawn here on the e file. So Magnus responds with his rook over here to f4, protecting this. The pawn pushes forward to g5, and so the rook's going to have to move. Comes back here, now even if the rook swings over, that's going to be fine. He can move this bishop, and his pawn's still going to be protected. So in this particular case, again, just brings it back here. And the pawn's now going to come to h5. No reason to bring the rook over here. It's not really having any threat. And so, h5, and then we see the rook swing over here to f1, kind of have this battering ram over here starting to attack. We now see the bishop to e8. Again, the bishop's not doing too much. It's still pretty passive in the game. It really hasn't really gotten too involved into the game. Now we see the bishop come back here to c2, and then the rook coming over here. Again, very aggressive square for this rook here on c5. It's very centralized. It has a lot of different squares that it's protecting, and this bishop is being pinned down. So white wants to definitely make sure he gets out of this pin. Now we're going to see the rook come up here to f6, and then black's just going to push forward. Again, anytime you have pawns, it's important to push him just to put more pressure on your opponent. So that's what Magnus Carlsen does. He decides to try to control the center of the board with his pawn right here. Towards the late game, with rooks on the board, it's a little bit different. But if we can exchange all these rooks off the board, you always want to have your pawns on the opposite color of your opponent's bishop. So in this case, you would want all your pawns eventually on dark squares. Now, again, with rooks on the board, it doesn't mean as much, just because the rooks can pretty much take anything. So from here, we're going to see pawn push forward to a5. Again, trying to threaten both sides of the board, pushing not only on the king side but the queen side as well. Now we see the king come to d2, wants to make sure that he's not being pinned down right here. And now again, Anand just continues to pressure. Plays rook over here to b5, controlling the semi-open file, attacking this pawn right here. Pushes forward, again, no real threat. Now the bishop to h5. This is kind of the first time that this light square bishop for black has really gotten to the game. So now we see king here to c3. And now, again, check, and now the king comes back here to b2. Nicely tucked back here. It's no in real danger right now. Now the rook swings over to d8, and then after we have this rook is threatening to come down here to d2, which is going to be really tough for white to deal with. So Magnus Carlsen plays f2, and now this rook's going to swing down to d4. And as you can see, just in a matter of about 6 or 7 moves, black has done exactly what he needed to do. He needed to get more aggressive. He needed to get his pieces involved into the action. Magnus Carlsen moved away from this d file, and so black immediately took control of it. He needed to get his light square bishop involved into the game. h5 is not the most efficient that it can be, but it's definitely a lot better than it was. So this is kind of even for both sides. Nobody has a clear advantage right now. Black has definitely done a better job of getting to this point, where white had definitely a small advantage, but that's kind of evaporated by now. Now the rook's going to swing over to h6, and we see the bishop come down here to d1, and then the bishop comes back. Again, doesn't want to have to worry about any of these crazy exchanges. And then the rook's going to swing over here to b5, and things start to get a little crazy. We see the king up here, and after pawn to f5, black is actually threatening mate now. We see the rook can now come to b2 or b3, excuse me, and threaten mate, which again is important that this pawn's here. Now there's a nice little outpost for this rook here on d4, and because white has a light square bishop, he really can't do a whole heck of a lot to disrupt this. So white has to respond to this mate m1. So he brings his rook over here to b2, kind of protecting this, but Anand is really forcing the action right here and kind of forcing white to kind of stay back and defend. So the pawn comes to e5. So this is, again, kind of double having this outpost right here. But this rook, on h6 is still kind of a pain for black. He can really not get his king involved into the action, which you'd really like, because white just completely dominates this 6th rank right here. So white's going to start to put some pressure on the pawns over here, since this pawn on e4 is kind of blocking any of the action from the rooks getting involved. And so we see pawn here to a4, and then we see just the exchange. So both sides decide to go ahead and take some pawns, and a few pieces come off the board, and now white comes over here and takes on e5, and then after the king takes, we see the rook swing back over here to h4 and threaten. So if we kind of look at it, all of a sudden a few moves gone by, and what looked like a pretty strong attack, Magnus Carlsen was able to find a nice little advantage as we come to it. Now the rook's going to swing over here to d1, and then white's going to push forward from here after the king moves and the bishop comes back here. Then we see rook to c1, and this was really where the game fell apart for Anand. As far as where he should have gone, something like rook to a1 makes a lot of sense. Again, threatening this pawn on a3. No real way to hold on to it, long term, and so this is going to be fine for black. But in the game, again, he played this rook here to c1, and because of that, he ends up losing material. So, the king comes here to b2 threatening, the rook's got to move, so the rook comes over here. And now this bishop can swing into the action to g8. This king is forced to move, a little in-between move before he takes this bishop. So, the rook swings up here to h6, and then after the king moves and the bishop takes, then the king's going to take this pawn here on b3. So again, that small little move from Anand just to say, hey, I'm going to bring my rook over here to c1 instead of adding more pressure over here, let's say on a1. Again, he's now down to material, and from here, again, there's just not much Anand can do. He's just down too much material. He does take this G pawn, but then this H pawn right here. And Magnus Carlsen has pawns on the A file and the H file that he can just push up the board. So it's going to be extremely difficult, especially Magnus Carlsen being one of the best in-game players in the world. Just very sharp when it comes to tactical lines. There's just no hope from here from Anand. So he did decide to go ahead and play things out a little bit more. Magnus Carlsen wasn't even worried about his pawn on the E rank. He just decides to go ahead and start pushing forward. So the pawn's going to push forward. The rook swings over, but that's okay because a7 is being protected by this rook over here. And then after the king to h4 or c5, then h4 by this pawn pushing forward. Again, can't really protect both of them. This rook can just swing over here to g7 if he wanted to, start pushing forward over even further if he wanted. Again, you can't stop both of these, and so in this particular case, Anand decided to go ahead and resign. So an exciting game. Again, Game 5, we finally have our first win. I know some people out there were hoping and praying that we didn't have all draws, but if you remember, even in the last game, as I was watching Anand play, it just seemed like he couldn't find the calculations that he usually does. I don't know if he's nervous or he's tired or if he's intimidated by Magnus Carlsen, but Magnus Carlsen always found these small little advantages. He couldn't quite come up with a win the last two games, but with the white and black pieces, Magnus Carlsen was dominating, and so I just felt like all it took was kind of a longer game like this one. This game took almost 6 hours, so these longer games where Magnus Carlsen can kind of grind down his opponent. I actually think Magnus Carlsen will kind of snowball this. I don't know if he'll win the next one with black pieces. I think he'll play somewhat conservative, try to take a draw and go into the next game. Being up, you don't have to try anything too crazy, but I actually think that he'll actually get a win in one of the next few games, and it'll kind of snowball out of control. Anand will have to play aggressive and try to go for a win, and Magnus Carlsen will take that, find a mistake, and actually end up winning a few more games. So I'm excited. Definitely a great game. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this series, and I'll see y'all in the next game. Thanks for watching.